I'm speaking in good faith today with Rainn Wilson, an Emmy-nominated and Screen Actors Guild award-winning actor, writer, and producer. His book, Soul Boom, Why We Need a Spiritual Revolution, is what we're exploring today, and it explores the benefits that spirituality gives us in creating solutions for an increasingly challenging world. Wilson co-founded Soul Pancake, a digital media company designed to celebrate humanity and champion creativity. And he hosts a podcast, Metaphysical Milkshake, with Reza Aslan, who was a previous guest on our show. That sounds like a lot of fun.
It's been so much fun. We get to have hilarious and profound conversations with some of the deepest thinkers and writers in the world. And we do it in our own kind of irreverent way, and it's a dream come true to have those conversations.
Nice. Well, I can tell what I'm subscribing to next.
All right.
Sounds fun.
Thank you.
So the book, Soul Boom, I'm really enjoying this, maybe because this is just right up my alley of what I'm really interested in. But I love how you how you give your credentials at the beginning. And because I have a book in my hand, I'm going to read your own words to you just briefly. You say, I'm no authority on spirituality, religion, or holiness, and I'm anything but enlightened. Yes, I've read and studied a great deal. I've suffered deeply. I've pondered and contemplated and meditated. I've struggled and many times failed, but aren't writers on spiritual topics supposed to have life all figured out? I'm here to tell you that we don't. So actually, I really like these qualifications, that you've lived some life and studied and had some hard things and thought about it. Some of us do the first parts, but we don't do the thinking about it. So tell me about how the thinking about life and spirituality turned into this book.
That's such a great question, and I love that way to lead off, and thank you very much. It's one of the struggles I had, and I talked to my wife when I was writing the book about this issue, was that I'm no guru. I don't want to be a guru. I don't want people to read this book and go, wow, Rainn Wilson is so wise. I've got questions for him, and Rainn, what should I do about X, Y, and Z? I don't know. I have no idea. And so many that are in this space and talking about kind of spiritual transformation kind of come to it with a guru mentality or spiritual teacher mentality. I'm not even a spiritual teacher. I'm a deeply flawed guy. I struggle. I've fallen down a lot. I've read a lot. I'm going to share some big ideas. I'm going to throw a lot of spiritual spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, as I say. And I guess for me, I want to start off by quoting the great Julia Cameron, the writer of The Artist's Way, who said at one point in time, I don't even know where she said it, I come to spirituality not out of virtue, but out of necessity. And I just love that. I love that. I love that idea. And I relate to that because essentially, long story. I'll do the super short version. I grew up a member of the Baha'i faith. I'm sure you'll have some questions about that later on. But Baha'is believe in the essential divinity of all the world's faiths. So I grew up thinking about spirituality and life's biggest possible questions a great deal as a child and as a teen. We talked about death and the soul and God and the meaning of life and why we have suffering and what our purpose is and connecting to God and what prayer is, what is sacred. These conversations were rich and ripe in my life. When I jettisoned the Baha'i faith in my 20s, as many leave their faith, and in fact, I was just talking to Pete Holmes, who you should have on your show if you haven't already, the comedian Pete Holmes. He was talking about the prodigal son returning, and that we're all prodigal sons. We all fall down and screw up our legacy, and then we come back, and then in God's grace and mercy, we're accepted. But as I turned away from religion and faith and spirituality in my 20s, because I just wanted to go be an artist in New York City, I became very, very unhappy and suffered from what I now know to be a number of mental health issues. Crippling anxiety, depression, occasional, rare and occasional suicidal ideation, alienation, great discomfort, pain, loneliness, and addiction. And that's when, in my heart of hearts, in my gut of guts, I thought to myself, well, perhaps as I say in the book, I've thrown the spiritual baby out with the religious bathwater. There might be spiritual solutions to some of the pain that I'm undergoing. So that set me on a course to really dig in to the spiritual experience and to figure out what it was that I most believed.
You describe investigating and studying a great number of spiritual practices. What was it that brought you back or that you found when you returned to your Baha'i faith of your childhood?
So I started with the first question, which is, do I believe in God, or is there a God? This took me a good 5 to 10 years of search. Again, this came from a deep struggle. I needed to find answers, and I'm so grateful for the suffering that I underwent in my 20s and early 30s that pushed me to seek, that pricked my curiosity. It's interesting because as I wrote this book, Soul Boom, I got reacquainted with a guy that I had been to college with 30 years ago. I'm kind of dating myself right now. It's actually 30 plus years ago. 35 years ago, I went to college with this guy. And I was checking in with him about what his beliefs were. And I remember him saying to me in college, yeah, I know that I think there's some kind of God energy, spiritual energy in the universe, but I certainly don't believe in an old white man with a beard on a cloud, looking down on us and being all judgmental and, damning us to hell and stuff like that. I don't believe in that, but I believe there's something more. And I was like, oh, okay. And we kind of had a conversation about it. And then I checked in with him now 35 years later after this book. And I was like, so where do you stand on God? And he's like, well, I definitely believe that there's something spiritual out there, but I know it's not an old white man with a beard, but I definitely believe that there's some. He was in the exact same place 35 years later. So I am so grateful that in a way I hit kind of a spiritual bottom, as in a 12-step terminology, because it forced me to kind of dig into these questions, because otherwise you can sit there for decades, and many people do. They say, I have a problem with God, or I just don't know what God is. I don't know exactly what my higher power is. And you can be there for decades. And so this is a long-winded way of saying, get curious, my friends, and dig deep. Life is short, and there's a lot to uncover. So sorry for the long roundabout messaging there, but I read the world's great religious texts. I read the Bible, I read the Quran, I read the Bhagavad Gita, the writings of the Buddha, a bunch of stuff around the Vedas and Upanishads, some of the most ancient holy texts, which to me still have some of the greatest life wisdom inherent in them. And I read a lot about Native American spirituality, which helped me a great deal in my understanding of God, the Creator. And while doing this, I was able to go back and read holy texts of the Baha'i faith. When you grow up a member of a religion, you often aren't directly really reading the texts themselves. They're being interpreted for you at a Sunday school class or children's class or through your parents. So I was able to then have my own personal experience of reading the writings of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, and Abdul Baha, his eldest son, that was a great spiritual teacher. And that re-galvanized my belief in the Baha'i faith, and it felt true to me and the most appropriate and the most practical as well.
Good. I do want to come back to what I think are some very beautiful Baha'i concepts. This book seems sort of, you tell me if I'm reading this correctly, maybe a little bit aimed at people who might have discounted religion or not maybe even given faith or belief much thought. But other people like me are going to read this who come from a place of faith. What do you hope that those people see in the book or are caused to think about?
So you're you're spot on. That's a very keen question. So it is definitely aimed. I try and bring a lot of humor to the enterprise because that's just who I am. So
And
I try and
is that an intentional pun at start mentioning Star Trek in the first part? The Enterprise.
And yes, so I use Star Trek analogies and television analogies peppered throughout the book. I wanted to make it accessible for the average young person or office fan that wasn't thinking very much about spirituality or religion. And some people say like, "Oh, is this a book for people that are spiritual but not religious?" And I'm like, kind of. I think it's a book for everyone. So I want someone who's, whether you're a born-again fundamentalist or you're a diehard atheist and anything in between, I want people to be able to get something out of the experience of reading this book, because I think probing deep philosophical and spiritual questions is valuable for everyone. But I guess for the people of faith, the second half of the book is really aimed at this idea of a spiritual revolution. And I think that all too often in Western culture, and especially in kind of the spiritual but not religious set, we think of spirituality as something that fulfills us personally, that touches our heart, that transforms us to be a little bit wiser and more serene, and it quells our anxiety. And then we leave it at that. And I think for the average churchgoer, you might go a little further than that. Then you bring community into it. And you're like, I want communal prayer, communal meditation, communal service. That's wonderful too. But what I'm talking about in terms of a spiritual revolution, and this is the kind of like sociological component of what I'm writing about in the book, and that is social transformation through spiritual tools. And I'm talking about a radical revolution. I'm talking about a radical reconception of how we do most everything by using spiritual tools. And that can be your Christian tools. It can be your Muslim tools, your Jewish tools, Buddhist, what have you. But we need to kind of rethink how we do most everything in contemporary America. The systems we can see are breaking down because systems that we've created have been are founded on the very worst qualities of humanity: competition, contest, one-upsmanship, every man for himself, individuality, kind of chronic individuality. Of course, there's a certain measure of individuation that is healthy and allows a certain measure of freedom that is crucial for happiness and well-being. But one example that I've been talking about recently is healthcare. So it's come to light over the last couple of decades that these kind of hedge funds have been buying up healthcare facilities, doctors' offices, medical groups, hospitals, rehab centers, etc. And then they redline them for profitability, and they close down and sell off the ones that aren't profitable, usually in poor neighborhoods. And rather than simply legislating a change in the laws that kind of regulate who can buy and sell medical facilities, we really have created a for-profit medical system in a country where a medical system, I believe, getting to the roots of what Jesus would espouse, needs to serve the poor and needs to heal people. And that's why the most powerful, richest country in the history of human civilization is unable to heal people because it's based on kind of consumerist profit above all. I'm not espousing an end to capitalism. This is not a socialist lefty kind of thing. It's again, going to spiritual principles. Why don't we redefine completely from top to bottom what the purpose of a healthcare system is? Then, and this is the long-winded answer to your question, Steve Perry. Don't stop believing, Steve Perry. Don't stop. This is where a person of faith can say, how can we take what Jesus said in the Bible, the red letter Bible, and put that into practice in such a way that it allows for social transformation and makes the world a better place? Because that's the other part of the spiritual path that we don't talk enough about.
Thank you. That leads me to some questions that you talk about the importance of sacred in a human life. And you even give a list of 5 questions to help readers ask themselves what is sacred or not sacred to them. And later I want to ask about how that applies to even what you just talked about, what we respect as sacred. But can I ask you these questions? And I'm curious to know, and I hope our listeners will ask themselves these very questions that come up in your book that you go into depth about. But one is, what is holy to you personally?
It's interesting. I was on a Zoom meeting remembering a dear friend that had passed away, who just had a heart attack and died at age 60. And there was a group of his friends and one fellow who I knew to be an atheist was on the Zoom, and I said I'd love to share a Baha'i prayer for the departed. And I read the prayer very sincerely from my heart. And Baha'i language was written in the mid-1800s, 1860s, 1870s, right? So it has a 19th century feel to it. It's also translated from like classical Persian and Arabic. And in its translation, it was sought to kind of like mirror the heightened and beautiful language of like the King James Bible, let's say. So there's some verilies and thous and stuff like that thrown into the writings. And I finished the prayer, and then the second later, this atheist friend of mine was like, oh, verily, that's funny hearing that word verily. I think we should use verily more in our common speech. And I felt hurt. And
yeah,
because this was very sacred to me, to say these words, to be remembering the spirit of my dear friend, Javier, to be kind of communing with his soul and with the Creator is a sacred and a holy act and a holy remembrance. And to kind of tell a joke a second and a half after I had finished the prayer was, I thought, inappropriate and insensitive. I didn't bring it up. I chose not to in this case because, and I'm not saying that all atheists are this way. This just guy happened to be an atheist. And he happens to be a little insensitive. And I've known him for 15 years. He's also a really good guy. And he has been there helping the family through this passing of Javier and been incredibly helpful putting together his memorial, et cetera, like that. So just a loving, great guy. And you choose your battles, but that's an example for me. So I talk in the chapter, it's called The Sacred Pilgrims, and it's a chapter about when I went on a pilgrimage to the Baha'i Holy Land in the north of Israel, where there's a lot of Baha'i historical sites, where the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, is buried, which for Baha'is is...
I've actually been lucky enough to go there too.
Wonderful.
To that whole complex and be able to go where I was able to.
Oh, wonderful.
Go. It was just beautiful.
Wonderful. That's great. That's great. So you can feel the power there and the beauty. And in my week and a half there, 2 weeks there, I just had such a sense of the sacred, the profound, the holy, the sacrosanct. And then I get back home and it's text messages and emails, and I'm stuck in traffic, and I'm wolfing down breakfast because I got my next meeting, and my kid gets sick and I've got to get him to the doctor, and I'm just in life, and I'm like, I really miss the sacred. So I don't have any answers around this, Steve, and I'd love to hear from you and your listeners too about how do we find sacred spaces and holy spaces in our lives, and how do we then bring that sacralization into our into the everyday. I don't have an answer around that, but it certainly is missing in our contemporary culture.
I really like your second question. I think that talks about that. Where does sacredness live? And in what you just shared, I thought for me, recognizing that what is sacred to someone else, I will hold sacred if I'm able to. Like the comment you made, the prayer you read, that someone would dismiss that, to me feels like not recognizing something that's sacred for someone else.
Yeah.
You write very movingly about this pilgrimage that you made to Haifa, to the Baha'i headquarters. You also mentioned taking your son. And I am so curious because as a parent, we want our children to have all kinds of experiences and have open eyes, open ears. But you approached that pilgrimage with a lifetime of experience, which he didn't have. Are you comfortable sharing what his experience was like?
Sure.
Or has he talked about that?
Really, what I wanted to give him was an experience of the sacred, an experience of the holy. It's one thing to just talk about it, and we're having a discussion, and someone is listening to this podcast while they're on a Stairmaster, or they're walking the dog, or they're in their car on the way to work, or they have it in the background while they're washing the dishes or something like that. And you can talk about sacred all you want, but you have to feel it in your bones, what it means. So I wanted my son, who was 13 at the time, to experience the sacred, just so he had it in his bones. And we've spoken about it a little bit since, but I hope that it will just always stay with him, in the same way that my Baha'i upbringing kept me connected to an idea of a higher power, to the idea of the power of prayer, to the idea that we're all spiritual beings having a human experience on a journey into the divine light. That had been fed to me like mother's milk as a child, and I was able to access that more as an adult. So we strove to give that to Walter. I don't know if how, or when it may pay off, but I hope it does. And by the way, I don't believe that the sacred necessarily has to be at quote-unquote holy sites or a church or a place of worship. I have had the same experiences in nature, filled with awe and wonder at the splendor of God's creation. And I've had the same experiences while witnessing art, being a part of art, and making theater, writing, hearing words aloud. And I do think that art can also evoke in our hearts that sense of the profound, the sacred, the transcendent that we're all looking for.
Do you find that sometimes in a conversation, that you've created a sacred space with that conversation?
Wow, that's a great question. I think any elevated conversation about spiritual topics, which is, by the way, something that we're encouraged to do as Baha'is, is to just engage people. We're not trying to convert them to anything. We're just engaging folks in the bread of life, the conversations about God and the Holy Spirit and the meaning of life. It can be an incredible sacred service to engage in that. And then when you're speaking with true intimacy and on a heart-to-heart level with love, yeah, I've had sacred experiences like that. Have you? Sounds like you have.
Definitely. Where in my mind, I just start picturing, this is just me, my background, Gothic arches or something, and open air with trees and all of that just seemed to sort of form around the conversation. And it just feels like, whoa, something just happened between us.
Mm.
That's how I picture it. And I like the last of your 5 questions about sacredness, which says, what have we lost by not having more sacredness in our lives? And we live in this particular society where we see more and more casualness, or maybe that's just what I'm reading into it. But do you see a loss of the sacred in our lives, and that we lose something by not having that?
I do. I think the king of this conversation is Thomas Merton. And I'm no Merton scholar, but I've read several books by him, and I love New Seeds of Contemplation. And it's on my bedstand. For those who don't know, he's kind of the ultimate Catholic mystic who bridges Catholicism and the Eastern traditions. And for him, kind of a solitude and mindfulness and contemplation allow him to bring the sacred into his everyday life. And granted, he lived in a beautiful monastery, Gethsemane, in Kentucky. If you haven't visited it, it's really extraordinary. I've been a couple times. I actually got to stay in his hermitage, the little cabin where he wrote many of his works. Yeah, it's a very special place. It feels sacred to me, where a brilliant mind and a beautiful heart composed poetry and theology. But he's kind of the king. I would turn to Thomas Merton rather than to myself. But what have we lost? We've lost everything by not having more sacred in our lives.
You talked at the beginning of our conversation about a years-long search for God. Is there a God? What do I believe? I'm wondering if you can tell me about the search. I don't know that it had an end or if it's ongoing, but it seems like at some point you settled on some sort of faith in a higher power, in a God. What did you recognize in your search when you thought, I think this is what I was looking for, or this qualifies as what I was looking for? Or was it even like that?
Yeah. It was a very specific process for me. I was reading about Native American spirituality, and I came across the example of Wakantanka from the Lakota Sioux tradition. And the phrase Wakantanka, which is the name for the creator, means the great mystery. So I immediately responded because I love that. As an artist, I love that. The great mystery. What is that? I'm drawn to that idea of God as the great mystery, not as like Odin, or Thor, or some like manly man with superpowers. And as I started,
who is also part of the Marvel universe,
right? And yes, it sits on high and is able to throw thunderbolts down, and is judging us all like kind of some Marvel Santa Claus. So Wakantanka is known through nature. That's the only way to know the great mystery. How do you know him? You know him, or it, she, whatever it is, divine force, through the incredible panoply of metaphor that is inherent in nature, through the power of the winds, the strength of the sun, the beauty of spring opening blossoms on the trees, the silence of the forest, the scent of the grasslands. These are how we know the divine, the great mystery. And this God is beyond time and space. It's the God of our ancestors. It's the God of love. It's the God of the 7 directions, north, south, east, west, up, down, and the 7th direction, internal, into the heart. I could go on, but suffice it to say that for me it was very important to completely separate God from any kind of beingness. David Bentley Hart talks about this in his magnificent work called The Experience of God, which is a great tome that it's a little bit thick, but I highly recommend to anyone who's on this kind of search that they dig into The Experience of God by David Bentley Hart. But he talks about stopping thinking of God as a being among other beings. And he says what most people think of God is actually what was known in the Greek tradition as the demiurge, which is a god man, again, with superpowers, kind of like what we think of like Odin. And I needed to remove God from any patriarchal or male sense, even though I do use he and him because it just kind of makes the most sense. And to know God through nature. This was very revelatory for me. So I spent a couple years, Steve, in all honesty, saying to my friends, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in Wakantanka. Now, this feeds into the Baha'i tradition in the sense that the main way that we know God in the Baha'i faith, or his principal title, let's say, is the unknowable essence. God is known and repeatedly referred to by Baha'u'llah as the unknowable essence. And in the Baha'i faith, we say a prayer every day in which we say, I bear witness, O my God, that thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. So we're created to know God, and yet God is labeled as the unknowable. So we're supposed to know the unknowable, and that is the center of the spiritual path. And again, that ties in with this idea of the great mystery, and I just love it. I get lit up like a pinball machine when I think about that.
Is that something you had to come to be comfortable with what you don't know?
Yeah.
Or what you can't completely know?
Yeah, it's a journey, It's not an arrival. That's why I don't believe in gurus, because I'm on a path, and I know like 1/100th of 1% about spirituality, and that keeps me humble, and it keeps me moving forward, and it keeps me curious.
One of my favorite principles from Baha'i teachings is the oneness of humanity. And to talk about that, and a few friends of mine who are of that faith, they are on fire with passion about that and about helping people realize that. I wonder, and I'm so sorry, we could do a whole hour on every chapter and have a great podcast series, which maybe you should do sometime. But you talk about pillars at the end, sort of suggestions. So with this idea of oneness in humanity and turning from division towards each other in a respectful way, recognizing sacredness, are there one or two things that you would share first off with our listeners, how we can do this spiritual revolution you're talking about in the book?
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, so I was going to end the book a chapter earlier, and I was realizing, it's so depressing. I'm ending the book on such a downer. And there is, I need to uplift people as they walk away from the book. So what is the spiritual revolution? I end on 7 principles, and I don't have a copy of the book right here in front of me. But just out of memory, there's a couple of there's a couple of key ideas that are inspired by a lot of Baha'i ideas. And one is loving diversity. And when we think about the flowers of a garden, we think about the wonderful diversity of the flowers and how thankful we are for that diversity. And every flower has a strength. This one has a physical beauty. This one has a great aroma. This one is, fills the space beautifully. We're so grateful for that diversity. Why aren't we grateful for humanity's diversity? We can be grateful for different sexual orientations and different skin colors and different, I guess, genders and men and women and cultures and sociological classes. And and temperaments as well. You know, we need the crazy artists, and we also need the accountants. You know, we need all of that to keep humanity moving forward. So embracing diversity, finding unity in diversity is a key Baha'i concept, and something that we have not yet embraced as a species on this planet. We're still in this tribal nature of like, our tribe is better than your tribe, or our tribe knows better than your tribe, and our tribe is going to suppress your tribe. And we have to, that's one thing that we have to eliminate.
Right. I'm reading here, tell me if these are the 7. Create a new mythology, celebrate joy and fight cynicism, destroy adversarial systems, build something new, don't just protest. Is this the list you're talking about? Systematize grassroots movements, invest in virtues education, and harness radical compassion.
Yeah, nice. Wow, I wish I had written that. One of the things that your listeners might be interested in is the second to last one there, is education in spiritual virtues as a tool for social transformation. So this is a little bit different than like the Sunday school concept of like right and wrong. It's a little bit different than that. It's about the fact that, like, Steve, when I meet you, and I don't know you, you look a little bit like my dad and a little bit like my Uncle Carl. You seem kind, and you seem sensitive and like a really good listener, and you seem very warm-hearted. So those are my perceptions, right? Those are also qualities of the divine. Those, you might have little fragments, little shards of those qualities in yourself, but God has them in total majesty and magnanimity. So these spiritual virtues, kindness, patience, creativity, love, honesty, humility, are all qualities of the divine that we can grow in ourselves, and we need to nurture and grow in ourselves so that we, reach the point of our deaths, the point of our passing, fulfilled, maximized, our divine essences maximized. But we can also educate children in them. And it's fascinating work, because I've done a little bit of work in this space, that if you say like compassion, and you make it the virtue of the week, and you teach kids about compassion, you say, we're going to observe compassion all week. Come back next week, we're going to talk about what we observed. And again, it's not like be a good girl, don't be mean, not right and wrong. It's just like notice compassion, witness compassion. You say, oh, I saw this guy, and there was a homeless man, and he saw the homeless man, and he bent over and gave him a sandwich, and it was really beautiful. And then you train the kids, because children need to be trained into witnessing these spiritual gems that they can then start to grow in themselves. This isn't taught at schools, obviously. Oftentimes it's not taught in the right way at Sunday schools. And oftentimes for parents, it's kind of like the kid will tell a lie and they'll get in trouble, and the parent will be like, don't lie. But the parent hasn't spent the time to nurture the kid and to grow their honesty and their appreciation of honesty and how beautiful it feels to live an honest life. So that's a part of an education. And as simplistic as this sounds, and it does sound a little Sunday schoolish, it is profound. And if we want to have large-scale social change, then virtues education, I think, is one of the keys in that direction. I highly recommend a book called The Family Virtues Guide by Linda Kavlin Popov. And it's a magnificent, easy-to-use guide with your children in this type of education.
Just a few final questions here. You use a metaphor about our life here preparing us for the next life, sort of, and this was pretty visceral because it involved the senses, like a fetus having eyes and ears that aren't useful in utero. And yet they are exactly what will be needed the moment there's a transition to the next stage. What is it that we're learning, or we can learn in this life, that is preparing us for something we don't know yet?
Well, this is exactly what we've been talking about. So in this way of understanding the world, the child is growing elbows and eyelashes and ears and eyes and jaws and any pancreases that it's going to need in this world. And it doesn't necessarily need those senses, especially in utero. And if you were to ask a baby, hey, why do you have eyelashes and ears? It would be like, I have no idea. It's just kind of there. In this world, we are, from a Baha'i perspective, growing those spiritual virtues that I spoke to you about. And they certainly do serve us to a certain extent here. I mean, if one is humble and kind and honest, you can have a far richer, more meaningful life in this world. But when our bodies drop away and we move on to the next plane of existence in our spiritual journey, then that's what we're taking with us. We're taking with us stuff in this world that are the senses that we will need in the next world, incarnation, heaven, happy hunting grounds, nirvana, bliss, whatever you want to call it. That's what we're going to be utilizing.
I've really enjoyed Soul Boom, Why We Need a Spiritual Revolution. I'm actually not all the way through it. I've been jumping around, but one thing I really enjoy, and I think listeners will enjoy, is your storytelling and the illustrations. And that you don't always make yourself the hero of your stories, which seems refreshing. So a phrase we do hear a lot is, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And even sometimes flip the other way around. And you have a chapter called Let's Build a New Religion, which sort of sounds like visiting Build-A-Bear and sort of pick what you want from the buffet. So tell me about this.
Yeah, so the fastest growing religious movement in the Western world is spiritual but not religious. They're known as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, because they check on the quiz online or on the forums, what is your spirit, what is your religion? None of the above. So the nuns, spiritual but not religious. I have several chapters devoted to religion in it. I kind of bury it. It's kind of like the meat in the sandwich, kind of buried in the middle. Because I, as a member of a religious faith, and I'm deep and good friends with members of many different religious faiths, I see that there are tremendous benefits to religion itself, not just spirituality, but moving past that to having a systematization of that spirituality and being able to harness the energy of community towards social good. And yes, going to church on Sunday and you sing with your choir and then you go home and watch the football game and then you're a dick all week long, that's not what we're talking about, right? But being part of a group of people that are seeking transcendence, seeking to be of service to the world, that are loving and supporting and nurturing each other is an incredibly beautiful thing. And, humanity has lost something by jettisoning religion itself. There's a great many benefits to religion that now, believe it or not, a lot of social scientists, a lot of positive psychologists are starting to look at that. Hey, wait a minute. Kids of faith aren't having quite the depth of the mental health problems that kids of no faith are having. There might be some actual benefits toward the obtaining of well-being through being a member of a group, which allows you to be part of something larger than yourself, because we live in a very solipsistic contemporary culture. So there's a lot to explore there. I certainly understand why people have turned away from religion, and religion is responsible for a lot of tremendous ills and violence and judgment and vitriol and righteousness that are detrimental to the growth and maturity of humanity. But at the same time, we really have lost something, and that's worth exploring.
Rainn Wilson, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Steve Perry, I'm going to need you to sing Don't Stop Believing, because that is also sung by Steve Perry.
Oh, can I do
Sherry's
Sherry?
Fine.
Don't stop believing.
Okay,
hold on to that feet.
That was too much. And I just needed to know that you were not the other Steve Perry. Thank you so much. I
think I proved
it
that
very
admirably.
well. Stick with podcasting, brother.